This is the first module of the lectures for March 8th to March 12th that have to do with the historical development of Congress, and then which is essentially Chapter 2 in Davidson, Olezik, Lee, and Schickler, and Chapter 1 of the Baker book on the House and Senate. In the last lecture, I discussed the founders' design for the Congress, and that's essentially what Davidson and Olezik discuss, and Lee and Schickler discuss in the first part of Chapter 2, and also Baker has a long discussion of the purposes of the Senate, which is fine, and I think amplifies what I was talking about, the framers' intentions as we laid them out in our discussion and reading of the Federalist Papers. So what I'd like to do is then, in the discussion of this module is to discuss how Congress has developed historically and what issues with respect to Congress's present function are laid out in, or rather called into existence. The kinds of questions about how Congress functions today are developed in watching how it changed and developed historically, which is really the rest of Chapter 2. And in the second and third parts of the lectures for this week, we'll discuss essentially in Chapters 3 and 4 the structural features of the representative function that we saw described in Federalists, in the whole panoply of the Federalist Papers in some ways that we discussed in the last lecture. So if you're looking at the notes that I passed out for this section of the class, I want to talk a little bit about what I've called in Roman numeral 1 as a postscript to founding. And the suggestion made by Davidson and Olezik and many other scholars, by the way, that the present development of our constitutional institutions is out of whack because we've seen in the last 2 centuries an augmentation of presidential power and authority and functioning within the constitutional system, which is true, by the way. And some people suggest that the augmentation of presidential power and authority and scope within the constitutional system in American politics has been a kind of a derailment of the framers of the intention, because they intended the Congress to be the preeminent and major branch of government. Now, I actually don't subscribe to that theory, first of all, because I tend to identify myself as a Hamiltonian when it comes to the founding. And Hamilton, if you have had my course on the presidency or will take it this fall, Hamilton was a great advocate of a presidential-centered constitutional system. And Madison, by the way, was the great advocate of a sort of a Congress-dominated system. Now, but it isn't just because I agree with Hamilton, but what tends to support the idea that Congress was intended to be the major branch of government, and that therefore there's a kind of a functional subordination, or that Congress somehow that there's been a defunctioning of Congress by a virtue of a movement of power and authority away from it in the direction of the presidency and even the judiciary, for that matter. The main arguments, some of which are dealt with in these chapters in Davidson and Olezik and Baker, one is kind of an obvious sort of, I guess this shows my editorial opinion of it. The argument is Congress is intended to be the major branch of government because Article 1 is the longest article in the Constitution. Hence, just on the simplest level, I've never actually thought there was a very persuasive argument, but people make this argument, that Article 1 is long, Article 2 is relatively short, and Article 3 is even shorter, and therefore of the 3 branches of the national government, clearly Congress was meant to be the dominant or organizing branch of the others. Let me just respond to the argument that there's evidence for that in the length, because it's true. Article 1 has 10 sections compared to the skimpy 4 sections of Article 2 and the 3 sections of Article 3. And so does that mean that Congress was intended to be the predominant branch, the central branch of the constitutional system? Well, to some degree, that also has plausibility because you could say, sort of following Locke, that the legislative institution, which is the rule of law, in the Lockean system and in the early state constitutions, was indeed intended to be the predominant body in order to ensure the rule of law. But again, what the framers discovered between Locke in the late 1600s and the first experimental state constitutions after 1776 and the Revolution culminating up through 1787, which began the refounding of the country on the Constitution, as they discovered that the dominance of the legislative branch did not necessarily lead to the rule of law. Hence, the whole point I was making about the founders and what Congress is the invention of the written Constitution, which then grounds the rule of law for the whole society in a trans-governmental structure, which itself is the fundamental or supreme law of the land, because it's the direct act of the people constructing society. So my argument is simply because Congress, Article 1 is the longest of the articles in the Constitution, doesn't necessarily mean that the framers meant for it to be predominant. In fact, my argument is that constitutionally, theoretically, what we call the co-equal branches is the proper reading, that each of the three branches of the national government of the Constitution derive equal constitutional authority from the grant of the vesting clauses in the Constitution. And as for the relative length of Article 1, why is Article 1 so long? Because it turns out that Article 1 especially carries the tension between the two notions of union that we discussed in the previous lecture. And that much of Article 1, in terms of founding Congress, the national legislature, had to deal with separating the authority of the national government and its legislative functions out from the residual authority left to the states. So the reason Article 1 is so long has to do more with the legislative embodiment of the complex nature of the American Union. And the other main argument that scholars make to support the intended dominance is that the fact that, and this is true, Davidson and Olzik and Lee and Schickler, I might just refer to them as Davidson and Olzik to save time and breath, is because Congress has the authority to create the other branches. Now, Congress doesn't create the other branches per se. The Constitution creates the other branches. But it is also true that Congress, by and large, does design fills out the constitutional design of the other branches. It creates the offices. It determines their powers and salaries. That is true. But having said that, I don't think you can derive a superior amount or predominant amount of constitutional authority and predominance from that fact. The reason that framers left it up to Congress to create the rest of the executive branch after the president and vice presidency in the Constitution, or to set the president's salary, say, or to create the structure of superior and inferior courts in Article 3 and their salaries and powers and all that, is because their view of the Constitution was, as John Marshall says in both Marbury v. Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland, is that the function of a Constitution is to lay out the general outlines of government and set up the core institutions. And so otherwise the Constitution would be hundreds of pages long because it tries to do everything in politics. Instead, the Constitution, designed by the framers, does lay out the broad branches of government, and then leaves to Congress to kind of fill in the analogy to a coloring book, primarily because the framers wanted to leave that function to subsequent generations. And that's why they created the authority within the Congress to do that. Now, that's just a comment on that, because the idea that Congress is supposed to be the dominant branch does figure in several scholars and commentators' weighing of the relative function or dysfunctionality of Congress. For instance, later on in the course, when we come to criticisms of Congress, especially by Thomas Mann and Norman Ornstein, Mann and Ornstein, who wrote two extremely critical books, which I mentioned in our first lecture and in our Surviving Residuum on the syllabus, The Broken Branch and It's Even Worse Than It Looks, which, in terms of a criticism of Congress, it's hard to think of a more critical title. And part of their argument is Congress is the broken branch because it has yielded up much of its power to the executive branch. Now, there is an important question in there, whether or not Congress has, in fact, delegated too much of its power in certain respects to the executive branch. But I think that criticism goes too far in suggesting that, again, that Congress was supposed to be the central or dominant branch of the constitutional system. The other interesting thing in terms of a proscriptive founding, and we will come back to this when we pay more attention to Baker's book and the comparison of the House and Senate. Baker organizes his discussion of the framers' bicameralism, not terribly different from the examination that we saw when we looked at the Federalist Papers, that the House was supposed to be the more numerous, popular, and representative branch, and the Senate was supposed to be the more deliberative and competent legislative branch. But remember, again, there is something to that notion that the framers thought the Senate would be more competent legislatively, and the House more embodying of representation. But remember, they wanted both houses to perform both of those functions. And when we look at some of the historical changes, we'll see that the way that Congress has evolved, that actually those differences, relative differences, the House more representative, the Senate more deliberative and competent in terms of crafting legislation, those differences have been somewhat muted, but I still think the framers' design obtains and actually organizes Congress's functioning, as we'll see. But in Baker's book, he has an interesting take on this, and we will come back to this, because you'll see that it is the key to his eventual defense of the filibuster. And the presence and nature and role of the filibuster in the Senate's internal life and deliberative function and legislative function has again become a critical issue because of anything, the results of the 2020 election, and the fact that everyone probably knew in November of 2020 that the Democrats would probably not take the Senate, and probably the expectation was that the two Georgia Republicans would actually keep their seats, and therefore there would be a 52-48 balance in the Senate. And because of the opposition to Trump's agenda and the embrace by the Democratic Party of Biden's agenda, and because of other things, there began to be noises heard in the political culture of America in the last 7 months, that perhaps the filibuster should go the way of history. And all kinds of critiques of it were made in the last 6 months by prominent politicians, such as former President Obama, who, I think mistakenly, by the way, attributed the existence of the filibuster and its centrality in the Senate's functioning to Jim Crow, the period of Jim Crow. As you're going to see, it's a little more complex than that, and the filibuster is older than that, and the Dove and Aronson book, Defending the Filibuster, takes, you'll see, it will explain where the filibuster came from and why it seems to be so central to the Senate. But there was some discussion about possibly, and there still is, by the way, the reason, for instance, that the massive COVID relief package that was just passed by the Senate and House, the reason that was able to do that was because of the awareness that in the legislative process, the filibuster, which then empowers the minority. Now, technically, the Senate is 50-50 right now, but you know that the vice president is the constitutional president of the Senate, head of the Senate, and votes when there are ties. And so the whole reason that became important was because the COVID relief bill, I think that both President Biden and the Democratic leadership of Congress knew that there would be substantial Republican opposition to it. Indeed, not one Republican voted for it in the House or the Senate. And therefore, with the threat of the filibuster, In the same way that Obamacare in 2009 was voted, passed the Senate, even though, by the way, at that point the Senate had super majority, although Ted Kennedy died of cancer because from the 2008 election, the the Democrats did have a super majority in the Senate of 60 votes, but then that was lost, and then Scott Brown, a Republican, was voted into office to replace Kennedy, and therefore the Democrats lost their 60-vote supermajority, which, as you're going to see, is what's necessary to cut off a filibuster. So, in the same way, this whole aid package, the Democrats were aware that if it followed the normal legislative route, that it might be filibustered by the Republicans. And of course, they avoided that by going through what's called the reconciliation process, which is the final stage of the budget process. And when we turn later on to congressional rules and procedures, you'll understand much better what that budget process is and where it came from, how it developed, and since the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Reform Act of 1974 that set up the existing budget procedure for the Congress, you'll see the process of reconciliation refers to the way that both houses of Congress bring the proposed spending for the coming fiscal year in line with the budget projections. They reconcile the projected spending with the projected budget projections of both houses. That's why that process is called reconciliation. And Senate rules allow measures to be passed in that reconciliation process with a simple majority, which means 50%. And then when you add the tie-breaking vote of the vice president, that's why this whole aid package on the Senate side was passed through that budget process rather than the regular legislative process. But to step back from that, some of the threats or the suggestions made that, because you understand that the filibuster in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s was then extended to the whole realm of judicial appointments and other appointments. But then in 2013, it was eliminated by the Democratic majority at that point from lower judicial appointments. And then in 2017, the Republican majority in the Senate eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court appointments, and that's how Trump got his 3 judicial appointments in. But the legislative filibuster still exists. So the last major question, aside from the overall functioning of Congress, that we'll deal with in this class is the filibuster a good thing? Because it truly is one of the most important and unique functions of the aspects of the Senate's functioning. That is unlike any other legislative body on earth in terms of the power that it gives to an individual senator or a minority within the Senate. So we'll turn to that question after we finish comparing House and Senate in the Baker book to the specific defense or criticism of the filibuster. And the reason that I'm mentioning it now is in the end of chapter 1 of the Baker book, when he's describing the relative constitutional functioning of the House and Senate in terms of the bicameral intentions of the framers. He creates this interesting distinction. It's not his. It's actually several other political scientists have suggested that between two kinds of democracy called adversarial or adversary democracy versus unitary democracy on page 4 of the 4th edition that we're using in this class. Page 26, I'm sorry. And what adversary democracy means, he means a democratic function where you hear from everyone's voices. Unitary democracy, where a democracy that looks to the common good. And so pay attention to the distinction, because we'll come back to that, because he sees that as an important way of understanding the relative bicameral functions within the constitutional system of the two chambers of Congress. And you'll see that this notion of unitary democracy is an important element for the defense of the filibuster, as we'll see. So what I'd like to spend the rest of the time doing in this discussion is summarizing the major changes in the Congress over history from the time of the founding that we discussed in the last lecture. And I've organized those changes as more or less as described by Davidson and Olzik, Lee and Schickler, and Baker, with the following categories: overall changes in the character of Congress that's due to the evolution of the national government or the nation itself. Because the greatest political development since the time of the founding has been the strengthening of the size, scope, power, and function of the national government in our system of government. And in my American Political Thought class, that's one of the major things we'll be discussing with respect to the framework that Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America brought to his analysis of American politics in that massive volume from his visit in 1831. And the major changes that led to the strengthening expansion of the size, scope, and function and power of the national government were first the Civil War, which meant you had to destroy the states in order to subdue them and keep them in the Union, the southern states. But that's not an exception. I mean, that's not an overstatement. But then, of course, the rise of the national economy and the intensification of the regulatory and welfare state in the New Deal. But of course, then also, and this, as you'll see, Baker makes something of this in his book on the Senate, the rise of the U.S. as a major world power, if not the world's superpower, at least for the coming, at least during the bulk of the 20th century. And at this point, even though China seems to be catching up to us, if not overtaking us in that respect, the world's largest and most important historical superpower. That obviously means that the foreign affairs and defense function of the national government expanded, and to some degree that also affected the way Congress operates. So the second set of changes will be actual constitutional changes, and that means primarily the major constitutional change of the 17th Amendment. We'll talk about the implications of that. And then in Roman numeral 4 of the notes, if you're looking, the internal structural changes. And that primarily revolves around the three internal structures that evolved after the founding that really dominate the day-to-day functioning of Congress, and that's the party system, the committee system, and the rise of congressional staff, and we'll have a brief discussion of that. And then the last one, Roman numeral 5, deals with what I call accidental changes, although also probably somewhat deliberate. And by that I mean primarily external changes in the political and media culture of America that has had a profound effect on the way our institutions operate. But also some deliberate changes that have had an extremely profound effect on the way our institutions operate. In particular, by the way, the rise of the modern campaign, some of what is discussed in chapters 3 and 4 of Davidson and Olzik, the subject of the rest of the other two lectures in this week. So let's go back and then summarize the changes. So first of all, the overall changes that come from the character of Congress because of the change in the way the change in the nation and national government. I list first size and racial representation. It would probably be better to start, as Davidson and Olzik do, with the workload and session length, because up until about the beginning of the 20th century and even beyond a little bit, Congress only, do you remember in our discussion of the framers and the framing of the founding, how the idea is that, and also Locke for that matter, that the legislative body would only meet for part of the year, and that the rest of the time, when they weren't meeting in session, doing their business of representation and legislation, they would be back in their districts or the parts of the country they represent, living under the laws and living amongst the people whom they claim to represent. And that obviously changed once the workload of Congress began to expand as the agenda of the national government expanded, and that led to the year-long session. Now that complex development led to something that we'll be discussing quite a bit, and as Davidson and Olzik do, the professionalization that Congress was probably, it's true, the framers thought that Congress would mostly be a kind of an amateur affair of part-time legislators who mostly lived under their laws back in their districts and seeing the effect of their laws on the people around them. But now members of Congress spend the bulk of their year, with the exception of a few weeks here and there where they go back to their districts and states to campaign. And that, it turns out, has a profound effect, especially on what we mean by representation. And indeed, the deepest question posed by the professionalization, by the year-long session, and the idea that now Congress has become a kind of a profession, by the way, also influenced by the rise of what we'll see is incumbency in the House, in both chambers, but especially in the House of Representatives, where an incumbency refers to the tendency of an occupant of an office to be reelected. And that is a major development in the House of Representatives that has somewhat changed the way that institution works. But the big question, the deep question that's raised by that is, if we now elect year-long representatives to Congress who then actually move to Washington and only connect with their local constituencies and states when they come back to visit, which are now exceptions to their general service, does that mean that the representative function has been attenuated or weakened, or perhaps even displaced by the rise of a professional elite of legislators? That's not a trivial question. And as you're going to see, that's why we spend so much time, not only from next week when we'll read Chapter 5 in Davidson and Olzik, which is essentially the summary of the great congressional scholar Richard Fenno, whose great book Homestyle will use part of that, but then also he has a later summarizing some of his findings in Homestyle, which is an intensive and precise examination of exactly the way members of Congress relate, especially members of the House, relate to their districts. So now, the other thing that the change and the rise in scope of the national government, and also just the size of the country, and the growth of the country geographically and in terms of population, was the growth, the size of the institution. We added eventually 50 states, perhaps more now, but that means the Senate went from 26 senators at the beginning of the country to now 100. And the House went from 65, where the framers in the initial Congress kind of guessed what the population of each state was before the census. And that's the primary reason for the 10-year decennial census, to track shifts, growth in and shifts in population across the country. And so the original rule of representation, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, was originally at least one for every 30,000, which means that if we had kept that, there would be over 10,000 members of the House. And as Madison says in his discussion of the appropriate number to ascertain representativeness, if every Athenian had been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still be a mob, which consisted of about 25,000 individuals at one time, cycling through the more or less 125 to 150,000 adult male population of Athens, and so around the turn of the century, they decided to fix the number of the House at 435, and in Chapter 3 of Davidson and Olzik, where we talk about things like apportionment and everything, we'll see what a district constitutes, because again, we'll turn to those complex issues, but obviously the House is now 435 members, and so not only did the ratio of representation change, roughly each member in the House now represents, roughly, they can be exactly equal, because remember, each state according to the Constitution at least gets one representative. So that means a state like Wyoming or Montana or North Dakota or South Dakota, where my brother lives, or Rhode Island, whose population only numbers in the hundreds of thousands, they still get one representative, as opposed to, even though California gets more representatives, obviously, 53 of them, although that will probably change because as a result of the apportionment this year, the census. Nevertheless, that means because of that requirement that each state gets at least one representative, you can't have each congressional district with exactly equal amounts, but you can have them roughly equal. And it turns out that the typical size of a congressional district day is about a little less than 1 million, and in some cases 1 million, but around 1 million. which is a different ratio of representation from 1 to 30,000 to 1 to a million. Now, of course, that also poses the question. Now that each representative represents so many more people, does that mean that that representative link has also been weakened or diluted or attenuated? And we'll raise that question. Although Madison does say in Federalist 10 that one advantage of a representative system is that you can expand the size of the country. And so in some ways, that's the question we'll be weighing. Did even Madison anticipate a country as large and populous and where one representative would represent millions of people? And whether that changes the nature of representation. A couple of the other external overall changes that have affected the way Congress functions, and Davidson will discuss this, and we'll discuss this very thoroughly later on, especially, by the way, in comparing the House and the Senate, because there are significant differences here, is the rise of constituency service. Members of Congress have essentially 3 or 4 major functions: representation, legislation, etc. But it turns out with the rise of the centralized welfare state, where in fact the major portion of the U.S. budget today, roughly 70% of it, is providing direct benefits to individuals, and therefore constituency service, where the idea is that the primary function or a major function of a representative Congress is to be like an administrative ombudsman to constituents who need complaints and that kind of stuff, or who turn to the Congress to help them with the massive federal bureaucracy. So constituency service is probably the bulk of what most members of Congress do, as opposed to what? Simply representing the opinions of their constituencies in the crafting of legislation. But that's a big change in the way Congress works and what we expect from members of Congress, and we'll examine that later. And of course, the other big change is the rise of the U.S. as a world power. And you might want to look in the Baker book on page 19 in his first chapter, where he discusses, when he's talking about the development or evolution of the Senate. Now, the framers always anticipated that, in fact, they designed the Senate so as to be more national in outlook and more connected with that function, because they gave the Senate the additional functions of approving treaties and executive appointments to both the executive branch and the judiciary branch. So the rise of the U.S. as a world power obviously in some ways also increased the scope of the Senate in certain aspects of foreign affairs. All right, now the second grouping on Roman numeral 3 is actual constitutional changes, and here we're talking primarily about the 17th Amendment. The Senate was originally elected by state legislatures, and the 17th Amendment, which was passed, ratified, I believe, in 1913, substituted election by state legislatures by direct election of senators. So what that means, by the way, functionally is, and then we'll talk about how it may have influenced the nature of the Senate. Baker talks about this in pages 20, on page 17 and 20 to 21 of his book, is, of course, we remember from our discussion of Madison that the function of representation in the House is guaranteed by direct election. And as de Tocqueville points out, we may idealize direct election, and it obviously is a way of establishing a link between a member of Congress and the constituency. But as de Tocqueville points out, popular elections are ugly and demeaning and debasing, and therefore, as Baker paraphrases and quotes, when de Tocqueville came to this country, he saw a profound difference between the social character and the caliber of individuals in the House and Senate, where he thought the House was a collection of bumpkins and local functionaries, whereas the Senate was this august collection of statesmen and profounder and deeper characters. That might have described the Senate versus the House at one time, but clearly one thing that direct election means is that now senators have to engage in prolonged and more expensive popular campaigns, because unless you're talking about a state like North Dakota or South Dakota or Wyoming or Montana, which only have one representative. You're talking about the constituency of a senator in terms of this whole state, like in California or New York or Illinois, is massively different, or Florida or Texas, is massively different and larger. So that obviously now, and you can look in chapter 2 as to why that change came about. Partially, it had to do with the perception that that senators were bribing their way into the Senate. There's a famous Thomas Nast cartoon in favor of direct election and criticizing legislative election, and it has a big fat senator dropping a bag of money into the election machine of the state legislature. And so there was this kind of fear that the Senate had become an oligarchic body dominated by wealthy individuals who bribed their way into it, because at the time of the turn of the century, about a quarter of the Senate were millionaires. Interestingly enough, a quarter of the Senate still is about millionaires, and we'll talk about their salary and emoluments and this kind of stuff. But probably the most important influence leading to the 17th Amendment was the rise of the progressive movement, which was an attempt to modify, both on the state and the national level, the institutions of the constitutional system so as to reflect the more direct input of popular input. For instance, around the time of the turn of the century, when the progressive movement was strongest, it led to a swath of reforms, like, for instance, referenda. So about 9 states, I think, have referenda procedures where the people actually vote for legislative proposals. California has that, and the South Carolina, I believe, is a referendum state. And 3 states still maintain recall provisions, and that is interesting to see because Governor Newsom of California may be facing a recall, as Governor Walker of Wisconsin faced a recall effort a couple of years ago. So these are attempts to kind of influence direct popular opinion, and the direct election of senators was part of it. But it did change the composition and nature of the Senate too, and we'll see but you'll also see there are differences between the House and the Senate in terms of the popular elections that they engineer, and that is the basis of their representational link. The next kind of changes I group into internal or structural changes, and in order of development, you have the internal party system of Congress, and as I talk about in American government in the presidency class, and just to mention here, under number 1, under Roman numeral 4 in the notes, and as they discuss parties in America, which are not part of the constitutional system, the framers, again, we'll see that the framers anticipated social competition and political divisions. That's what Madison calls factions in Federalist 10. And he understood, the framers understood that the different divisions of interests and factions in society would be the direct environment for the election of members to Congress. But in terms of existing and large, massive, organized political parties, that really hadn't developed in Western politics yet. It was just beginning to form in Britain and in some of the European countries, and very quickly after the constitutional ratification and the institution of constitutional government in our country in 1789 through the 1790s, almost instantly, major enduring interpretations of the federal government and its function and scope and size began to develop, and that led to the formation of political parties, and also the transformation of the Electoral College. But also within Congress, once parties formed and became part of our political system, parties quickly became the key to the internal structure and operation of Congress. And again, the party system, once it evolved, are the primary internal organizing and coordinating structures within Congress. Because, of course, Congress is a plural body, both are, and wherever you have groups of people, you have a kind of a centrifugal tendency, and therefore all plural bodies, as Madison points out in the middle 50s in 55 to 58, all numerous bodies have the problem of coordination and organization. And the committee system, which we'll talk about in a minute, divides Congress up and fragments power and concentration even more. So the major structure within Congress historically that coordinates congressional action and voting, as you'll see, is the somewhat hierarchical party system in both houses. And you'll see there are major differences between the House and Senate in terms of how parties operate within them. And by the way, primarily deriving from the question of size. The Senate is a smaller body, and you're going to see that one of the major differences between the House and the Senate is the Senate is a more personalized and collegial body. More because it's smaller, the dynamics of the Senate are quite different in terms of the individual senators, and that surfaced in terms of contemporary politics in the last couple of weeks because the two somewhat moderate conservative Democrats, Christine Sinema from Arizona and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, they became the sort of power brokers. And again, in terms of the preservation of the filibuster, you'll see both Manchin and Sinema have pledged themselves to preserve the filibuster, primarily because their view of the senatorial function and the relations between senators, again, is more personal and collegial. Nevertheless, the parties are powerful structures in both houses, and you'll see one of the issues in the contemporary evolution of Congress is the rise of more intense partisanship. There's no question that our parties are more polarized in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and that has had a profound effect on the way Congress operates, as we've seen in the emergence of just since the inauguration of President Biden and the new Congress. So, but clearly, even in the Senate, which has had the self-image of and the reputation of being more collegial and transpartisan or nonpartisan, even today's Senate is more sharply partisan. But nevertheless, the differences are somewhat muted by the character of the two chambers. But so we'll examine how the party structure developed and the way and the functions that it plays within the contemporary Congress. The second major structure to develop over time, also not anticipated in the Constitution, was the permanent committee system. And we'll talk about the kinds of committees that exist in Congress. And so it's hard for people to imagine how did the Congress exist without the structure of standing or permanent committees, legislative committees, 21 to 22 in the House. It depends on the session and some of the arrangements, and then 16 or so major committees in the Senate. Because originally, again, the Constitution doesn't mention anything about committees. And just briefly, we'll come back to this. How did Congress function prior to the rise of the permanent committee system? Because the first permanent committee was in 1816 when the House created the Standing and Permanent Appropriations Committee. And then very quickly the Ways and Means, so the taxing and spending committees quickly formed. Originally, in the first couple of decades, especially the first decade, when a bill was introduced, there would be some initial discussion of it, and then if it turns out the bill was too detailed or couldn't be thrashed out on the floor, then an ad hoc committee would be created to flesh out the contents of the bill and then be brought back to the House. Now, and all that began to change with the rise, as I mentioned, of the permanent system in the early 1800s. Now, the main change that engineered in the way Congress operates is, in most legislative systems, which are parliamentary systems, most of the action, not all modern legislatures have something like a division of committee function, of specialization of labor and this kind of stuff. But the main effect it had on Congress is whereas prior to the rise of the committee system, the floor really was where the action occurred in Congress, in debate and etc. But once legislation became too complicated and the committee system grew and developed, then the primary legislative function of Congress then moved from the floor to the committees. So you can't understand the way Congress operates as a legislative body, even in some ways a representative body, until you understand the way the committee systems work. And we'll talk about the different kinds of committees, etc. And then the third major structure, not mentioned in the Constitution, that has a profound effect on the way Congress operates, is the staff system. And originally, senators got one secretary, an amanuensis, in the early 1800s, and then of course, it has grown to the massive structures that now make Congress not an institution simply of 435 representatives and 100 senators, but a small city of 30 to 40,000 individuals. And we'll talk about the different kinds of staff and the role that they play, because they actually do present a critical issue about the functioning and nature of the representative and legislative functions. Every member of the House now gets roughly, depending on the individual and whether you're the Speaker or committee chair, every member of the House gets about 11 to 13 staff members, who are divided both into legislative staff and constituent staff, some in the local offices and some in Washington. Each committee in Congress also has its own staff, hired and maintained on a partisan basis. And then, as you're going to discover, originally 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4, and now 3 major agencies, staff agencies, grew to help Congress perform its functions. And the first major development staff agency was the Library of Congress, which began when Jefferson, who was a great president and a great architect. If you visited Monticello outside of UVA, the problem was he was terrible with finances, and he was consistently broken in debt. And he had one of the largest, I think the largest personal library of 4,000 volumes or so in the early Republic. In order to save himself from debt, he sold that to Congress, and that was the beginning of the Library of Congress, which, by the way, today has the largest collection of any library on earth. It's what the old Library of Alexandria used to be. And but then, as you'll see, the Library of Congress is only part of a larger institution called the Congressional Research Service, and we'll discuss more of that. And you'll see in a couple of weeks we'll come back to a really somewhat gripping question that the rise of staff has posed, and that has to do with Michael Malbin's article on deliberation and the role of staff, because most of the legislation today is, both in terms of the drafting of laws and the negotiation, is done by staff members. And so the critical question that Malbin raises is, we still elect members to Congress, and they still are the formal legislators performing those constitutional functions. But if we have delegated them to non-elected staff, does that mean that the nature of Congress is fundamentally changed, and that it's now, and that the laws of the country are being, in fact, drafted by unelected representatives? That's an interesting question, and you'll see Malbin has an interesting and complex answer to that. And then the last set of changes are what I call accidental, or at least environmental changes. And let's start with the middle one. The rise of national media and electronic media has decisively changed how Congress and members of Congress and senators relate to their constituents. In fact, several major questions about the dysfunctionality of Congress, or whether or not it is functioning, have to do with the way the media perform a kind of a filtering medium between the institution and the American public. And you'll see one of the other thing is now all campaigning, or most campaigning, the internet's changing this to some degree, but almost the major thrust of much of campaigning, both presidential and congressional, is now through television media, which is also expensive, and that's one of the reasons the costs of campaigning has gone up. Another development, especially in the House, is the rise of incumbency. Up until the 1900s, about half of the House, remember, the entire House stands for election every 2 years. And up until 1900 or so, roughly half of the membership of the House changed every 2 years, which means it did kind of represent the idea that the framers had that the House would be much more a reflection of shifts in public opinion, etc. But with the rise of the New Deal and the Depression era, and then up through the 60s, the rate of re-election began to grow, so that by the 60s and 70s, roughly the incumbency rate is 95 to 98%, which, as you're going to see, what that means is, once you get elected to Congress, unless you do something like run over babies or shoot up heroin on the floor of the Senate, once you are elected, and this is particularly true in the House of Representatives, not quite as characteristics of the Senate, interestingly enough, for reasons we'll see, but once you are elected, you can pretty much remain as long as you want. And that's one of the reasons people believe intend to support term limits, because the argument is elections, direct elections, that kind of representative base that Madison talks about in Federalist 52, only makes sense if elections are competitive. But you're going to see that incumbency is a major asset, and some commentators and analysts argue that with the rise of the incumbency, that congressional elections have ceased to be competitive. And if they cease to be competitive, that means in some ways the representative function may be called into substantial question. And again, that's why people advocate term limits. So we'll examine the question of incumbency in the House, and whether or not that poses that great and profound question of whether or not the fact that members of the House are by and large, even in what are called wave elections, when sometimes, like in the 2018 election, 40 new Democrats were elected to the House, and it shifted control from the Republicans to the Democrats. And those are called wave elections. But even so, even under those circumstances, the 90+% of members of the House are reelected. So that's an important question. If that's changed, the way that the function of representation is supposed to operate in our system of government. And then you'll see that the last major change is the way the modern campaign has evolved. And that's something that we'll talk about in chapters 3 and 4 of the Davidson and Olczyk. And we'll see, because obviously, as I mentioned, they're more media dominated. Incumbency has become an important factor, and money has become a critical factor in running for Congress. So that's the difference between the institution we see in front of us and the one the framers designed, and much of this course will be spent in examining those historical changes and how they determine the functioning of the institution we're examining in this course.